I am also on the Alliance Steering Committee, and what you will see is the other folks that are on the Alliance Steering Committee, you're going to see a little asterisk in the beginning of our name and possibly an SC, which marks Steering Committee. So as each person, we have several folks who will be speaking today, and as they talk, they'll introduce themselves then, but we wanted to make sure that we have a packed agenda, and we really want to make sure that we get to everything. So if you're curious who's on the steering committee, look for that asterisk again in front of our name. And you'll hear more about who we are and what the alliance is. And we're so happy to have you all join us today. It looks like we have about 43 people so far. If you could go ahead and do an introduction of yourself in the chat box. Type your name, your organization, and if you'd like, the area of the state that you're from. And that's always helpful too. And you'll see our steering committee folks are typing their names in right now. And so that's great. So if you can take a minute and do that. We are recording this today, so just be aware of that. And let's see. Rowan, can you go to the next slide so I can just give them the agenda and then we'll get going. So this is where we're headed today. So you're going to find out some more information about the Alliance, an overview of what the survey and the purpose and process of that was, and then an overview of the common themes of the survey. We're going to review the different criteria. How does the Alliance set legislative priorities? And then some additional, we'll hopefully have some time for some additional contextual information from the field, and then next steps. And so we will be together today until 1 o'clock. We're going to be mindful of our time, and it's going to be quick. Please, if you have questions, put them into the chat box. We have a couple of us that are looking at the chat box, and we'll gather those questions from there, and we'll make sure we bring that up. So, but to begin with, I see everybody's typing in. We've got some national folks on as well as state folks, and thank you so much for everybody for joining us. And I am going to turn it over. Are you ready? Rowan, with the next slide, and Jane, wonderful.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jane Downing. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Hope and Safety in the Salem area, and I use she, her pronouns. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Oregon Alliance to End Gender-Based Violence, established in 1999, primarily to work on the first funding in the state for community-based programs and victim service programs, and the Oregon Domestic and Sexual Violence Services Fund. Those of you who are in programs are very familiar with ODSVS. And this group worked on that, and over the years has worked to look at laws, look at legislation that is coming forward that in order to try to protect survivors, and to also look at things like that funding that is so core to what we do. Next slide. And we have been incredibly successful on many levels. One of those is that all-important funding, but also on job and housing protections for survivors, things like creating the address confidentiality program and advocate privilege, which has been so key to helping programs to be able to protect the confidentiality of survivors. And then working on those programs within colleges and universities, and then the sexual assault protection order, and many more. We could go on for hours talking about all the different things that the Alliance has been involved in, but leave it to say a lot of great things that have made a difference for programs and for survivors in our state. Next slide. I'm turning it over to, I believe, Melissa.
Hello, everyone. Melissa Earlbaum, Executive Director for Clackamas Women's Services. And just to move on to the next slide, the purpose of our survey and the process is to collect as much information as we can, to cast as wide a net as possible, so that we're hearing from practitioners in the field, advocates, prevention, response, as well as folks directly from survivors, and recognizing that sometimes that is one and the same. Many of the folks that work across this field also have lived experience. So our survey is meant to really kind of have a broad approach, collect as much information as we can. We recognize there's always limitations to surveys, but we do our best to try to get it out to as many folks that are involved in the field and do the work across a broad spectrum as possible. You go to the next slide. And the survey process, this is the timeline that we had this year. You might remember, some of you may have seen many emails. We extended the timeline a little bit throughout the process because we wanted to ensure that as many folks had a chance to review, to add their voice to it, to get the survey submitted. But we try to have this timeline where we're sending it out in the spring, trying to collect it by late spring, and really filter in all of the responses, bring that information back, which is the star in July where we are here, and then continuing to, take that information as well as other data points that you'll hear about in this presentation to start setting priority items for the legislative session. And just the only thing I want to say is the survey's been a practice for us for years and years, predates my involvement with the Alliance, and it's just been a great tool for us to collect very specific feedback and also watch trends and really hear from folks. There's a lot of opportunities for those who did the survey, you may have noticed, to enter in information, to add narrative, to add context, as well as, clicking boxes. So we really appreciate all of that participation.
I'm going to take it on from here. Thanks, Melissa. My name's Emmy Ritter. I'm the Executive Director at Raphael House of Portland. I use she, her pronouns. And just to pick up where Melissa was speaking, we every 2 years and every biennium, we've done this survey, and it's been happening for, I don't even know how long. And this year we had an incredible amount of responses, 223 responses across the state. And you could see here on the slide, like the breakdown of the percentages of different people that were participating in that, mostly from people who are people that work or volunteer for different organizations that care about domestic and sexual violence survivors. Can you go to the next slide, please? And here is, the group of different respondents that participated in this. It's really quite incredible, the diversity of folks that participated here, everybody from survivors and advocates to probation officers and corrections, community corrections officers. It seems like many of you who participated in the survey are on this call now, so yay, we're doing a great job of keeping the conversation going and a lot of feedback going, and really participating in what priorities we're setting for the couple of years to come. And we have community-based advocates being the top folks who have participated in this survey, which is wonderful because we know that these are the folks that are working on the ground, and 36% of identified survivors have participated in this as well. Now I'm going to pass this on to, I believe, Carly.
My name is Carly Brown. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the campus coordinator at the Oregon Sexual Assault Task Force. And the section that I'm going to be leading us through today is to look at some of the questions that we asked on the survey and sharing some of the data that we got from there, because that's going to be how we then prioritize and think about some of these topics going forward into the legislative session. So one of the substantive questions that we had asked for folks was, if you work for a survivor service program, so when we say survivor service program, that could be anything from community-based advocates to campus advocates, folks that are working as DAVAPs, anybody that is working to support survivors of sexual and domestic violence, and you had a budget that was unlimited, what are the top 3 things that you would spend money on? We can go to the next slide and we can look at some of the results. So these were some of the most common themes that we heard. We took all of those over 200 responses and then categorized them by theme. No surprise, housing is absolutely one of the top needs. And we see this most years for survivors, but particularly given the context of Oregon's housing instability and access for survivors, this was at the top of the list for most folks, most respondents. Staff support and advocate retention. This really talked about not only making sure that programs are able to retain staff, but then also making sure that as part of those retention efforts that we're able to help folks have thriving wages. And so a lot of folks that commented on this said training, thriving wage, access to be able to stay in their jobs as advocates, and also caseload. So knowing that advocates often, as our programs have a harder time retaining folks, have more of a caseload to care for survivors, that funding component to be able to keep those advocates in their positions feels very important. The other, I'd say, area that came up really often, and it often came up in conjunction with housing and with the advocate conversation, was flexible funding for survivors. So funding is really a primary theme that you'll see across many of these areas, but those flexible funding and services, really thinking about ways that survivors can have access to funds outside of some of the more stringent grant requirements that we have. So things that are really meaningful for survivors, like being able to purchase food, being able to purchase mattresses and other home care items that then they can keep with them, was really important for folks. We also had a lot of responses that commented on access to justice in the criminal justice system, if that is something that the survivor wanted to engage with, and then also asking for some better coordination in almost every county. I think we commented on how can we, as folks who work with survivors, coordinate, improve systems in the criminal justice realm to make sure that the outcomes there are as best as they can be for survivors. And some folks commented on joint training as well. And then excitingly, also had a lot of folks say, how can we better support or spend money on prevention efforts? So how can we make sure that folks in our communities are not experiencing violence or abuse in the first place, and making sure that folks have access to information, healthcare information about healthy relationships that then supports them on a trajectory to have healthy and fulfilling and thriving lives in their communities. So those were some of the top themes. Rowan, I'll have you go to the next slide. And one of the other questions that we asked folks that then we also pulled some themes from were, in your opinion, what is or are the greatest unmet needs of victims and survivors in your community? And Rowan, we can go to the next slide. Again, I think a lot of this for folks who work in the field, probably not surprising, but folks had incredible responses, really robust in terms of the level of detail that folks provided in those boxes for this section. Again, housing needs and barriers, so making sure that folks have access to funding to get them to safe housing. We know that safe housing is something that is a protective factor against experiencing violence, but also against experiencing future violence. So making sure that folks have their housing needs met. We see that a lot of communities are struggling with lack of legal resources. So funding for community programs to be able to then help survivors retain access to legal services. Specifically, folks also called out around parenting or around custody concerns. And so really making sure that there's a sufficient criminal justice response in those areas and others, and also access to those legal services. Need, again, for some more of that additional funding to be able to provide flexible funding to survivors to have their basic needs met. Everybody that commented on this commented about how it was too restrictive. We had a couple of folks mention lack of mental health care access in their communities. Again, not a surprise. That's a very difficult scenario across all of our counties in Oregon. We also had a fair amount of folks mention about lack of medical or sexual assault nurse examiner or SANE services. And this is an area where, as folks were commenting, saying things like, we have to drive a survivor from Central Oregon or Eastern Oregon to the metro area to get these services. We don't have enough of these in our counties or in our state. And so that piece we saw over and over again. And then also a need for identity specific services. And what we mean by this is services that really help to support folks who have language access barriers, or whose primary language is a language other than English, and knowing that amount of resources is insufficient here in the state, but also services for queer survivors, folks from the 2S LGBTQIA community, survivors of color, survivors that are Black and Indigenous. So really a need for more of those services that can support the unique needs of folks in our communities. And now I'm going to pass it off to my colleagues.
Right, I'm jumping in here, looks like. So I wanted to just tie into the Secretary of State report and audit that came out. For those who just need a reminder, that report came out in October, and several of us convened opportunities to have conversations with our providers across the state. So many of the domestic and sexual violence service providers that were able to participate, culturally specific providers, our system-based partners, family justice centers, advocacy centers, coalition, task force, different levels of coordinated community response. And we didn't get to talk to everybody, but we did our best to try to collect as much feedback as we could in the time frame that we had. You know, we didn't quite anticipate or know when the report was coming out, so we responded as quickly as possible to collect feedback in response to the report. And Amanda's going to put in the chat here just a link to our response. It's been sent out before and shared with everybody. We provided it in one of the legislative hearings, so it went on the record. Senator Solomon brought that in and put that on the record for us. But it had these 4 broad buckets, and you can see there's a lot of overlap here with what Carly shared from the survey, what you all know and have shared, our priorities and issues that we need to be focused on. Funding is obviously a key piece of that, increasing resources directly to survivors. So this talked a lot about that direct assistance, cash going to survivors to meet their needs, supporting coordinated local responses and starting there, and really prioritizing resources for that before creating something that would be maybe perhaps more institutional and top down from a statewide perspective. And then implementing statewide focused solutions that were informed by the community. And so within each of these 4 buckets in that report, the response to that report, there are examples of some of the ways in which these things could be accomplished. And what I wanted to share today is now we're doing the next phase of that work, where we're taking some of those examples and these buckets and the survey and the feedback that we've been getting from people across the state and starting to put some policy recommendations around that, short term and long term. So you'll be hearing from us again and more about this in the same way you did and have been about the survey. We're going to continue to collect feedback. We're going to, align everything together. But I just wanted folks to know that we're continuing to do that work. We've shared before that we need to take these sort of themes and suggestions and operationalize them a bit. And that's the next step that we're starting to embark on. So more to come, but just know that work is happening. It's really important. Many of our elected officials and folks from the governor's office, the Secretary of State's office, really want to know how they can be supportive and help the work that, help what we're doing across the state to best serve survivors. So we're going to continue to carry that work forward and appreciate the commitment that folks have to working alongside us to address these issues.
That might, oh, yep, perfect. 2025 legislative landscape. That's me. I'm Nikki Terzieff, serving on the steering committee, working with OCADSV and all of you. And an honor it is to do that, working in Salem with 90 legislators. These elected officials have effectively your scope and your fate in their hands. In addition to our partners, both in various agencies who come into play in either rulemaking or grant making, as well as the executive office. So in that knowledge, with that little piece of information, I want to switch to how any of that can change or how any of that changes, how any of those changes may impact what we're trying to do here. As you can see on the slide, I mean, we'd be crazy if we didn't start with the top of the ticket. For those of you joining from nonprofits or from state agencies or anywhere else that may be restricted, thanks for spending the last 9 minutes of your lunch break with us on this. So before 1 o'clock, I'll try and just hammer out this notion that, my gosh, what happens at the top of the ticket will matter.
Even what's happening right now, this roiling, this idea of who will the Democrats pick, and are the Republicans going to continue to coalesce behind Trump? All of that trickles down. And it makes a difference in voter turnout. It makes a difference in how voters get organized. Organizations will pop up and say, hey, don't forget you care about this issue. And because of this issue, we support this person or this candidate. And while they may be talking a little bit, about the federal level, what really is going to make the difference is the outcome down ballot, as we say, which is the November election here in Oregon. State House, State Senate. Right now, your state house has 60 members. All 60 of those members are running for re-election. So that's going to be a lot of potential change and potential turnover. There are probably 4 to 5 districts, possibly 6, depending on how some of the campaign finance things turn out. Lots of money out there, in particular on the business side of things with Phil Knight and the contributions that he's been making. How those things, those contributions play into these kind of like, let's call it 6 races, will help to determine whether or not, one, in the House, do Democrats keep their margin now, which is a majority? Yes, likely, but could they get a super majority? It's possible. And the implication of a supermajority is really important when it comes to funding things like tax increases, tax credits, when it comes to funding programs that would require 2/3 votes, or even changing policies like Measure 11. You would need a 2/3 vote for that. So can the House achieve that margin? If so, will they be met on the Senate side? 30 senators. So 2 House districts nestle within 1 Senate district. That 1 Senate district may or may not be up for election right now, may or may not be an open seat. Some of you may remember there was a handful of Republicans that got their time out. Actually, the state Supreme Court told them they were getting a time out because they were pressing against the rules of the chamber by not attending floor sessions and taking votes on bills, etc. And so those seats will change hands by name, not necessarily by party. So what will happen in the House may then fall flat when it gets to the Senate, because if the Senate also doesn't achieve a supermajority or doesn't have a 2/3, an ability to negotiate a 2/3 vote on something, you may end up seeing some massive reforms that begin in one chamber falling off in the other chamber. We also know there's some statewide races that are changing. Most important, I would say, to this community and to the work that you all do would be happening over at the DOJ. That's going to be a change in the Attorney General. Attorney General, top cop, some folks like to say, but what we know in that position and what we know of that role is partnership. And we've enjoyed a great relationship with the last handful of attorney generals, Hardy Myers and Ellen Rosenblum. We are going to see another attorney general come up, and I'll tell you, we're working to communicate with those folks already, because the work that programs do directly tied to not just the policies of that particular attorney general, but to the investment that the attorney general has in the work that you do. What kind of support will that person show in the legislature? Will they show up and stand with us and fight for funding? Will they come forward and put what we call POPs, put program option, policy option, and budget packages together for us? Or on our behalf, or alongside of us, I should say? Those are some of the questions that we'll get to learn. We do not see a change of hands in the governor's office for another couple of years. And so steady rudder in terms of having a person in that role who has always been supportive of our requests, supportive of what we need in funding, supportive of what we need in policy. We have historically seen Governor Kotek as a 10+ year legislator, and more importantly, as speaker, presiding officer, come seek us out and ask what we're looking for, and really work hard to accommodate the nuances of how you do the work. Being community-based is different, and it's important to hold that out. And we're working to make sure that message gets to all of these, not just the elected officials we think will come back, but the new ones. And that's important because there's a lot of competing requests. Certainly in policy, we will always be dealing with things that other folks want to do. Legislators get ideas from constituents or ideas from attorneys, and we have to respond. We need to be responsible and making sure that we can craft or shape or defend against legislation. That requires legislative friends, that requires people who understand what we do. And then that's in the policy realm. In the budget realm, boy, it gets fierce. You can imagine, you see this ARPA hangover and the budget forecast, depending on whether the kicker kicks, and of course, changes in leadership, and how is that going to impact how people spend the dollars. Rowan, if you wouldn't mind, I'll just go skip ahead to this next slide here, because this is a little bit of what's happening in the backdrop. We're going to be making some pretty serious asks. We've made advances and good strides in terms of what the budget is shaping up to look like. We need to defend that. We need to continue to make sure that those dollars don't get sucked away somewhere different, such as transportation or education or housing or land use or criminal justice reform or expungement issues. Rowan, maybe there's one more slide for me here, I think. The main point is we need to be present, and it's going to be really important that we have strong relationships with these elected leaders. So while many of you may be hindered in doing campaign work with your organization, as an individual under the First Amendment, you are capable of going and supporting a campaign with data entry. People will remember when you showed up to help on your own personal time and in your own personal capacity. That's very important, in your own personal capacity. But these legislators will remember. The goal being, as the shifting sands in Salem occur, we are considered a constant source of education and expertise as they make their policies, and a constant source of advocacy, so that when they decide to take a hard vote, when they vote for funding for our programs, and it may be at the cost of something else that they value and that the caucus wants them to support, that they have the political support from us and the community and the movement. So I think were that all my slides? Now I have to look to who's in charge around here. I think that might be all of my slides. But we really want to make sure that as we move into the legislative session, you can see here on this slide, plenty of things ahead of us that are not necessarily about making sure you have operations. And so that will be one of our first priority goals. Going in for VOCA funding, talking to the e-board, trying to get some action necessary. All those offices, those people that I listed off earlier, these electeds or soon to be electeds, they're going to be helpful to us in writing letters. They're going to be helpful to us in having conversations. They'll use their power positions to assist. And so we want to make sure that we're tracking on who comes out the other side of November. Thank you, e-board, the emergency board. That's right, we have an acronym. I appreciate this question, Angela. The e-board is the emergency board, and the emergency board is a construct of the legislature, and it's comprised almost historically always with the presiding officers and leadership in both chambers and in both caucuses, and a handful of selected chairs. It's really designed to provide a landing spot for funds and funding requests that are, as the name may imply, urgent or emergent. Sometimes they use these funds to dedicate towards wildfires. Sometimes they use these funds to dedicate towards, I think they used some for DHS and a little revamping of some child custody rules or programming. And we're going to come and ask them for some VOCA. Survivor housing funds, ODSVS, SANE Coordinating Commission. And if I'm stepping on anybody's toes, please jump in here, but I want to just make sure that we have the opportunity to outline some of the things that are really important. Community health worker status, advocate privilege. Those are pieces of statute. This is all law that has to either be changed or protected. And that means that we need your voices. And so I guess maybe this is the moment in time when I say what I normally say. And those of you who've joined before won't be surprised to hear me even with this intro, which is stay with us. We'll have asks, we'll have requests. This will come a little bit later in time. I don't want you to think that you're going to get off the call and get an action alert immediately, but know that you're always on our minds because we're going to need you when it comes time for advocacy. So keep us on your mind. That way things like threats to stalking order protections can be addressed by the experts we can lift up the voices of the clients that you serve and the families that you care for, and have a greater level of success because of it, because of your engagement. So engage with us. I think next slide.
Oh, actually, this is Sybil, and I might stick here just for 2 seconds. And thank you
Thank
so much, Nikki. Sybil Hebb with the Oregon Law Center. I use she, her pronouns, steering committee as well. And I just was going to add 2 pieces to this slide, Nikki, to the amazing context that you provided there, and just a little bit more detail on the VOCA funding cuts. There are about 40 programs across the state that are threatened right now because of, as Nikki mentioned, emergency cuts to federal VOCA funds that none of us knew about until the late spring. We were worried, but we weren't sure, and we learned the details in late spring after the last legislative session. There's about $8 million, a little more than $8 million, that will go away, that is currently being used in the state, across the state, for child abuse, domestic violence, sexual assault, important programs. And those programs are threatened if the emergency board does not act before October. So there is an emergency board meeting in September. We will be sharing out more explicit and specific information with you all. We're working on our one-pagers. We're doing the outreach with legislators, but just heads up, that will be an urgent and imminent need and an opportunity for you all to help by plugging in with your local legislators to say, hey, this is really critical. Those cuts are going to be even bigger for the next biennium, not to be disaster oriented, but protecting against those longer term cuts is yet an additional challenge that we will be addressing within the confines of the regular session that starts in the end of January. So there are 2 places where we're going to need to plug in to prevent against VOCA cuts that will have statewide significant impact if we don't act. So keep that in mind. The only other 2 pieces that I was going to add, just to flesh out on advocate privilege, I think many of you have heard from us that we are concerned about some of the threats to that statute, which is one of the most important statutes to survivors in, that there is. And so we are actively monitoring those discussions, and if those discussions, we should have resolution this fall. If those discussions do not go well, or those litigation cases don't go well, we will need to be advocating in the legislature. Hopefully, fingers crossed, they get resolved in our favor and we don't need to do that, but just heads up about that. And then I wanted to give a little bit more context to the threats to the stalking protection orders. We are aware that there are several discussions pending, not coming from us, but from opponents to modify the stalking protection order, another extremely important priority piece of legislation. And so we are reserving space in our agenda for the next session to defend against those threats. I'll move to the next slide. And just add, and Nikki mentioned the expungement discussions, which we know are coming up because legislators are planning those discussions and they are moving forward. It'll be important for us as survivor advocates to be present in those discussions. So we need to save time on our agenda to be present there. We heard in our survey that the criminal justice response was incredibly important. And we know that from our experience working with survivors across the state. And so that is clearly something that we will be prioritizing. Crime victim compensation funding protection is important. There are some concerns about whether that fund will be robustly protected in the next session. So we're working with our colleagues at the AG's office to ensure that we have the right structures in place to make sure that that is a consistently available fund. I'll just briefly mention 3 other issues that we know will be on the table for discussion this session. One is, some of you may have heard of deep fake AI techniques being used by perpetrators as a form of sexual harassment through the dissemination of sexually explicit images that are not technically of a survivor, but are crafted to look exactly like a survivor. And several states are taking steps to address that and make sure that our prohibitions on that behavior also extend to include this misuse of AI for this purpose. there are concerns that we are hearing around how survivors are able to access the U visa, which is a relief from deportation for survivors who are undocumented, who need to have relief from deportation for safety reasons and deserve that for lots of reasons. And the federal government allows survivors in certain circumstances to access that relief. There's some hiccups in how we are able to make sure that people can access that relief here in Oregon. So working with lawyers and others to help us identify what the best way is to address that concern. Also want to shout out to the governor's office for amazing support last session to help us increase the TADVS benefits. And that speaks to the need that we hear in the survey and elsewhere in our work that survivors need to have access to flexible financial assistance so that they can take the safety steps they need for themselves and their children. And for many, many years, the TADVS benefit was stuck at $1,200, which was so little money. When it was initially created as a program, that was enough money maybe to get in first and last month's rent or deposit and to actually use that money for a substantial safety benefit. Over the years, it has really not been enough to be useful. And so accessing that fund has gone down. The governor's office, and thanks so much to many of you who helped provide testimony and support for this, but the governor's office was able to increase that benefit to $3,200. That will start taking effect this fall. But the ultimate goal was to bump it up to $4,200. So we will continue to try to work on that and shore up that funding. So those are just some topics that we know match with the things that we've heard in the survey and the things, that we're all doing in our work with survivors across the state. And these issues are already on the table, because for a variety of different reasons, either they're emergencies requiring a response, or they are coming forward from legislators, or we've already worked on them and there's still finish up to do. If we switch to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit briefly about sort of how we pick what else we add to the plate proactively and how we decide how to spend our time. And so you can read the priority setting criteria here on the slide. And these are criteria that we have used since the Alliance began to try to help ration our resources. We're a volunteer group. We don't have staff. We work together. And thanks to all the steering committee members and all of you for all of the work that you do. But like there is no entity that has staff and support here. So we have to be realistic. And if we're not realistic, we do a disservice to survivors because we can't follow through with the things that we talk about. We lose credibility. And as I think many of us know, if you start a conversation and you don't have the oomph to finish it successfully, there are significant negative unintended consequences that can occur for survivors. And so these are the criteria that we use to decide how to effectively spend our time, making sure that we can, maintain and support the vision of safety for survivors, and also maintain our work as a credible source of expertise and successful achievement. And we have to take into account our capacity when we do that. So we think about the scope of the impact to make sure that we're prioritizing the things that are the most important. We also think about how do legislators like or dislike an issue. If they dislike an issue, how do we make sure we can build the change in attitude in a way that is not going to put survivors at risk? And we look at what are our possibilities for coalition or opposition, how big is the fight? And then we think about our resources. And one of the resources that we have to take into account, aside from capacity of our ability, is what does the state budget look like, and what are we asking for, and what are the other competing asks? And so another criteria that we kind of added recently, honestly, because we didn't used to consider this when we were thinking about our priorities, but we really need to also think about what is our capacity to support implementation. And we worked that criteria in after passage of advocate privilege, frankly, because that was such a huge priority. It was so amazing. It was great work by so many of you all and so many partners. It was very significant legislation. And then after it passed, the training and implementation and curriculum development like that need was huge. Frankly, I failed to adequately predict that ahead of time. I'm not saying we shouldn't have done it. It was absolutely important, the right thing to do. And we realized we needed to kind of like keep that in mind as we're picking our issues so that we can have the follow through that survivors need. So I think that is it from me. Thank you so much. And I will pass it to the next person.
Thank you so much, Sybil. Hi, everyone. I'm Shannon Rose, she, her pronouns, Executive Director at the Oregon Sexual Assault Task Force. And just take a deep breath. We just went through a ton of information over the last 30 or 40 minutes. So I'm just gonna go over a little bit of a recap with some next steps so you know what to expect from here on out from us. So first, as we've talked about throughout this whole presentation, we're going to continue our process of gathering information and applying that to our priority setting criteria that you just saw and heard about from Sybil. We will be looking at all of the results of that survey, as well as additional information that comes in to set our priorities and to look at what we will be focusing on in the coming legislative session. That will, of course, be impacted by a few things that are also on this next step slide here. So one, the revenue forecast in late August. That will give us a better picture of what the funding situation will look like heading into the 2025 session and what might be available and accessible for services and needs. The emergency board in September. That is piece one of the two parts of the VOCA fix that we talked about. So emergency board visit in September, we'll try to restore those funds that are getting cut and reduced from the federal level, filtering into the state. And then we will also likely be revisiting VOCA in the 2025 session after the first of the new year as well, to make sure that we're getting that full package complete and restored, and that programs and survivors have what they need to fulfill their services funded through VOCA. Next, election results in November. We heard Nikki talk a little bit about that. This is true at both the federal and the state level, that whatever happens in all of those races will impact how we move forward. It will impact who's sitting around the table, who's making decisions, what priorities are. And so we'll be looking and analyzing what happens there after we know those results in November. We will finalize our priorities. Hopefully our goal is early December so that they are in place and ready to go as we head into the new year and the 2025 session. We will absolutely be communicating with you all throughout that process and sharing what those priorities are, which leads me to the last point, which is that we will have multiple check back points with advocates. So we're going to be doing this a few ways. One, as you've heard us say, stay in touch, stay involved. So make sure you're on the listserv, make sure you're reading those emails we send out, because they could have things like action alerts or additional meeting times and invites, all of that stuff that we're going to be communicating with you. We also are excited to say that we're going to be launching a Alliance website soon, a joint project between our staff here at SATF and the staff at OCADSVA, and on behalf of the whole Alliance Steering Committee. So we expect that to come out in the coming weeks. And the intention of that is to really be a resource mechanism to continue to communicate back and forth with the whole community. So we'll have opportunities on there about how folks can get involved, whether it's with the General Alliance, potentially with the steering committee. We are trying to take feedback and be very thoughtful about what type of involvement folks want to have, what feels reasonable, what feels doable, given everyone's capacity, what feels representative and inclusive of the variety of services and programs throughout the state. So we are having those conversations now, and we'll be sharing more information about that soon on the website and through our email listserv. So please stay in touch. And as always, if there's anything specific that you want to talk about, you're welcome to reach out to any of the steering committee members, and we're really happy to have a conversation and get more information from you. So I know that we have a little bit of time for some Q&A, and I know some questions have been coming in to the chat. So I'm going to pause for a second. I think Bibi and Jane maybe have been monitoring our chat for us and can help walk us through some of those questions.
Sure. I'll go first, Jane, if you, unless you really want to go. I saw two that stood out to me. One was a question in regards to the ODS funds and the SHF funds, so survivor housing funds. And it was a question about our potentially like our request for an increase. Is that an increase from the baseline, or is that an increase from like what we got last time? So that's one question. And then the other question is about the survey, which I will let Carly answer, but as far as the ODSVS and SHF funds, I'm not really sure who would want to answer, but I will pass it over to somebody else on the steering committee.
I can jump in with some basics. This is Sybil, and invite anybody. Nikki, I think you unmuted. So one thing that we accomplished last session, thanks to just immense support from the governor's office, the AG, legislative leadership, judiciary committee chairs, so many people, was this brilliant mechanism to get us out of the situation in which significant chunks of our dollars were single one-time allocations. So we had to keep coming back to ask for renewal. Now, we always have to defend our current levels of service funding. Like, that's true, that'll always be true. There's no, guarantee in this world, but generally speaking, the legislative budget discussions, unless there are cuts budgets happening, but generally speaking, the legislative budget discussions sort of start from the continuing service level point. But we were always behind that because our continuing service level was technically made up of one-time allocations that were not like actually part of our ongoing budget. So last session, we were able to get the 6 million of survivor housing funds and the 10 million of ODSVS out of the one-time allocation world and into our continuing service level budget. And so that is our starting point for this coming session. Now, it's a question whether we're in a cuts budget scenario or not. Because, it depending on all the things that Nikki talked about, we could be really struggling to maintain access to services, but we are less worried about those dollars now than we are about the smaller allocations that were plussed up last session as one-time allocations. Nikki, do you want to talk about what we got there that we will need to be defending that way?
Happy to, and you'll correct me if I transpose these numbers, but we basically, the plus up, we essentially said, hey, we want another few million here. We went through the work of stabilizing the fund. So what Sybil's just describing in terms of the service levels, there's kind of our baseline. And then we went for a little more. And we managed to get, was it 2 or 3, Sybil? Now I'm not recalling, but
I think it was 1 each, if I remember correctly.
So, okay, we wanted to go for 3 to. Did everybody just see my balloons? That was crazy. Well, yay, we got money. It's not gonna do it now. Okay. But we did, and that is a cause for balloons, if you ask me. And now we'll be going back to recapture that plus up and maybe a little more. I think one of the things that you can trust coming out of this is that if there are a notion of any extra dollars available, we are going to go after those, and they will be added now. As our piece of advocacy will be to add those to the current service level.
And sometimes, we've always asked them to be added to the current service level. We've just never prevailed on that particular point because it's easier for the legislature to be like, okay, we'll do this for this time, but we're not promising to keep doing it. And so, it was significant that we were able to get over that hurdle on those big chunks last time. And so Nikki's, we are all in, as Nikki said, on trying to keep getting those things into the ongoing budgets. One thing I wanted to just mention also that I failed to mention is that the allocation last session for the SANE Coordinating Commission was only a one-time allocation. So that is a, obviously a very critical service that we need to make sure gets lumped into the ongoing continuing service level discussion, just like we need to do that with the SHF and the ODSVS budget allocations. So just wanted to flag that same.
And Sybil, I'll just say very quickly, this again, perhaps our third ask then to stick with us and be engaged. We always want to make at least 3 asks, like any good campaign, because those outcomes will also be reliant upon our agency partners. If, for instance, the Attorney General and the DOJ doesn't have a clear understanding, share a value set with us, those requests become infinitely more difficult. And the direction of those funds within the agency then becomes a thing that we need to worry about versus whether or not there will be funds. So wanted to just make sure that folks knew, it's not just on your state legislative shoulders, but there are all kinds of relationships that matter here.
I'll pop in really quickly. We had a great question from Martha about the difference between the two survey result slides, and just want to offer for folks, the only reason that the priority or that the order of the things listed there might be different from slide to slide is that they were two separate questions. So those two questions, we just gave you how folks responded in priority order to each question. So one was about how much, if you had an unlimited budget, what would you spend money on? And then the other one was, what are some of the biggest unmet needs you're seeing for survivors? And depending on county, depending on role, we saw some difference there. So that was the difference between those ones, but great question. Thank you.
I didn't see any other questions.
Okay, anyone have other final questions to type in the chat box? I know some of the questions were in there, got answered within the chat. Okay. I'm just trying to not rush anyone.
If we have a few more minutes, can you talk again? I might have missed Shannon's explaining the efforts that the steering committee is making to make itself more inclusive.
Oh, well, I suppose any of us can attempt to jump in on that one, Martha. I think what we've discovered is that we need to do, we need a process, and we need to be deliberate, and we need to be thoughtful about the process to do so. Being inclusive would be insincere if we thought, well, gosh, we just need to add this voice or that voice, or, it's still our perspective of what's missing versus an objective assessment for that. So we've had a couple of meetings dedicated to the idea that we'd be developing these processes and trying to find other resources to help us utilize those processes to do this in the most holistic way.
I think it's important to remember that this is a volunteer group, so it's an unfunded group. So definitely, yeah, Sybil just put in, please reach out, and there's some a contact number there.
I was also just going to say, I think, one thing that is really important that we have done in the past and have had trouble sustaining is just having more conversations like this, where we have more opportunity for more dialogue and have those more regularly. During session that gets harder, but prior to session, it feels like there is that opportunity and capacity. And so I think that's at least a first step of, trying as best we can to make decisions collaboratively, and also recognizing like there's a lot. I mean, we have some leeway, of course, and trying to figure out how we can use our time to expand in that leeway. And then also just, some of it is just like what's coming at us and how do we do the best job being responsive and in the moment. And, between now and September, it's like all hands on deck to make sure that we try to fill this $8.6 million gap that's going to defund critical services starting in October if we don't get it done. And so, it is a challenge to figure out how to like be effective and get that job done, and also manage some of the other pieces. And I'm the first to say, like, I think, you know, especially during COVID, we lost a little bit of our capacity there, and we have not built it back up again yet, you know, adequately. And so working on that and trying to figure out how to manage those dynamics.
It looks like there was another question about whether or not we'd be involved in doing direct advocacy during September legislative days. Does anybody want to answer that one? My knee-jerk reaction is yes, but I don't know what that would look like.
Absolutely. Nikki, go ahead.
I would just say absolutely, will be involved. I think this was Commissioner Rico who asked this question, you know, and those kind of talking points and the messaging points and all of these materials will be packaged and disseminated for all to use in developing their own and deepening or establishing a relationship with their own legislators. And it's something that we can, as we get closer to those September legislative days, talk more about the depth and the nuance of bringing them forward in in-person meetings together. Thank you.
And September Ledge Days are right before the e-board meeting. And so, you know, that is like the closest, and obviously a lot of that work has to be done well before then, but that's an opportunity to like make sure to follow up on any missing links or, you know, just make sure all our ducks are in a row.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. It's 1:28. We know that it's a Friday, there's other meetings. We had a great group today. I think we were up at 51 at one point. We had, you know, local programs, we had state administrators, we had some government folks, and then we even had a national person join us, to a couple national folks. So thank you, thank you, thank you. We appreciate all the work that you do on behalf of domestic and sexual violence survivors across in Oregon. We know it's hard. So I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Hope some of you get to enjoy this wonderful summer weather before fall is here. Oh, rockets. Oh, Nikki's got rockets. I don't know how she does that, but thanks everybody.